Hello everyone, welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Professor Soumya Uma. Now we will be discussing 4 modules on the role of NGOs in protecting human rights. Let's start with the first module now, and in this first module we will have an overview of the topic. Learning objectives of this module are: firstly, to understand what NGOs are and the mandate of their work. Secondly, to obtain an overview of the various types of human rights NGOs and their approaches. Thirdly, to analyze the role and functioning of NGOs in protecting human rights. And lastly, to examine the strengths, the weaknesses, and the challenges faced by NGOs. The structure of the module is as follows. First, introduction. Second, what are NGOs? Third, the growth of human rights NGOs in the last few years. Fourth, types of human rights NGOs. Classification of human rights NGOs by way of orientation, by way of levels of intervention, by way of nature of work. Fifth, functions of human rights NGOs. Sixth, what is the significance of the human rights NGOs work? Seventh, weaknesses and challenges faced by human rights NGOs. And lastly, the conclusion. So let's begin. NGOs constitute a part of what is known as civil society, a community of citizens linked by common interests and collective activity. Civil society includes NGOs that act outside the state sphere of activities in order to achieve certain goals relating to public interest. They often act as a bridge between state agencies and laypersons by protecting and promoting human rights of all, sometimes hand in hand with the state and sometimes by countering and questioning state's power, particularly when state misuses its powers. Although international human rights treaties vest the responsibility of protecting, promoting, respecting, fulfilling human rights and proactively preventing human rights violations primarily on states, NGOs play an important role as a conscience keeper and a watchdog to ensure that the states discharge their responsibilities with regard to human rights promptly and efficiently. Now, let us understand what are NGOs. What do we mean by NGOs? NGOs are private organizations that pursue activities to relieve suffering, to promote the interests of the poor, to protect the environment, to provide basic social services for undertaking community development. In short, NGO is an organization that firstly is not formed or established by a government or by an international government organization. Secondly, it is not part of the government. And thirdly, it does not work for profit. NGOs are called by various names and you must be familiar with some of these. For example, they are also called civil society organizations, called CSOs for short, non-profit organizations, NPOs for short, voluntary service organizations, VSOs for short, private voluntary organizations, civil society organizations, third sector organizations, charitable organizations, charities, activist groups, voluntary groups. So these are some of the names which are used to refer to and to describe NGOs. NGOs are voluntary groups that take up social causes and engage in a range of activities that are aimed at protecting and promoting human rights and to provide humanitarian aid and services. Since the 1970s, thousands of NGOs have been established all over the world. NGOs include a variety of groups such as development and research organizations, policy think tanks, community-based groups, non-funded activist groups, advocacy groups, victim support groups, counseling centers, training organizations, and humanitarian agencies. They provide law and policy analysis and expertise. They help with promoting and protecting human rights, and they also monitor the implementation of laws that are intended for the same. Some are organized around specific issues, while others have a broader mandate that allows them to work on a range of human rights concerns and issues. NGOs work at various levels, at the local, at the state level, at the national level, at regional and international levels. There are many reasons that contribute to a proliferation and growth of NGOs since the 1970s. At the end of the Cold War, it became easier for NGOs to be established and for them to function. Advancements in information and communication technology, which is known as ICT, these have also made it easier for the creation of new global communities and for like-minded individuals and groups to work in a collaborative manner across national boundaries on issues of human rights. Additionally, increased resources leading to increased employment opportunities in NGOs have also taken place since the 1970s. Some argue that NGOs are a natural corollary to free market economy, capitalism, and so on, when free market forces lead to exploitation, environmental degradation, and increased impoverishment of the poor. Those are the times when society demands that social justice has to be served, and that is when NGOs step up with their human rights work. Many NGOs continue to be monetarily supported by the state and by international funding agencies, even though they raise their voices in protest against the acts and policies of governments, of private actors, and of corporations. Now, let us move on and let us understand the various types of human rights NGOs that we have in the world today. NGOs, even as they work on issues of human rights, can be categorized differently. By orientation, NGOs can be classified into charitable oriented, service oriented, participatory oriented, and empowerment oriented NGOs. Here's a summary of these four types of NGOs. First type, charitable NGOs. These are primarily based on philanthropy and have a charitable approach to social issues. They often provide financial aid and essentials to vulnerable and marginalized people and communities on the basis of sympathy, without necessarily considering the receivers, who are also called beneficiaries, as equal partners. Such NGOs adopt a top-down approach. This includes NGOs who distribute food, clothing, and other essentials to the poor and the needy, as well as NGOs that intervene to provide relief during natural and human-made disasters. Now, the second type is service-oriented NGOs. These are an extension of charitable NGOs, but instead of providing material goods that may be essential in nature, such NGOs provide a service, such as holding a free health camp, free counseling, after a disaster, legal aid in prisons, vocational education, skill-based trainings. These are all services that are provided by such NGOs. Beneficiaries are expected to participate in the implementation and receipt of the service offered by the NGOs. Now, the third type is participatory NGOs. These are NGOs whose work primarily depends on the participation of the beneficiaries concerned. Here, the beneficiaries are involved in all the stages of the work, such as planning, budgeting, implementation, follow-up and evaluation. Additionally, the beneficiaries would also make a contribution in cash or in kind, such as making financial contributions, donating tools, donating space, donating materials, as well as donating their own personal labor. A good example of participatory oriented NGOs are those that promote self-help groups, community-based women's groups and youth groups, cooperatives, and those that implement community development projects. Such NGOs offer guidance to and facilitate the implementation of the project, but the leadership and the ownership is often with the concerned communities at the ground level. Fourth type, empowerment-oriented NGOs. These neither provide material goods nor services. Such NGOs also do not facilitate community-based projects to be implemented. Their primary goal is to help poor and marginalized people and communities to develop an understanding of social, political, and economic factors that impact their lives and to become aware of their rights in law. So, creating an awareness of their rights is a primary aim of this kind of human rights NGOs. Further, such NGOs are also dedicated to strengthening marginalized communities so that they do not become vulnerable to human rights violations. It's important to remember that all these four types of NGOs that we have discussed just now, these are not watertight compartments. There exist many NGOs which fall into more than one categories that we discussed just now. Moreover, we also need to remember that all these four types of NGOs contribute to protection and promotion of human rights of the poor, needy and the marginalized, although through different approaches. Hence, it is desirable that we are not judgmental about each type of NGOs and the work that they do. Human rights NGOs can also be classified on another basis, that is on the basis of their areas of operation. In this manner, the first type would be community-based organizations which mostly arise from the needs of concerned people at the ground level to organize and to empower themselves through a collective process. Many of them relate to everyday issues of survival, livelihood, sanitation, health, housing, basic amenities, food and nutrition, education and protection from violence. So, the members of such CBOs, which are community-based organizations, the members bond due to a common feeling of vulnerability or a common need, and also due to an experience of exploitation or discrimination or violation of human rights. The second level is the city level organizations which work on issues at the city level. Some examples are Lions Club, Rotary Club, Rotaract Club. They work to address issues of urban poor and other issues that may be specific to the city concerned. Such NGOs include those providing for shelter for street children and juveniles, for destitute women, for senior citizens, physically and mentally challenged persons. Third level is state level NGOs. These work across a concerned state, either by establishing branches in different cities or districts in a state, or by working in collaboration with partner organizations in other parts of the state. They primarily deal with human rights issues concerning that particular state. For example, in the state of Maharashtra, there are specific NGOs that work on issues of farmer suicides, whereas in Haryana, there are specific NGOs which work on issues of honor crimes and khap panchayats. Now, the fourth level is the national level NGOs, which work on issues across the length and breadth of the country concerned. They may establish branches or units or chapters of their NGOs across various states in the country. One example is Human Rights Law Network, HRLN. Another example is People's Union for Civil Liberties, PUCL. A third example is NAVO, National Alliance of Women's Organizations. Such NGOs may be funded, as in the case of HRLN, or non-funded activist groups, as in the case of PUCL. There are two distinctive aspects of national level NGOs work. Firstly, they work on issues and concerns that cut across various states and which find resonance with various states. And secondly, the impact of their work is at the national level in terms of influencing formulation of laws and policies, formulation of national networks, movements and solidarity groups. Fifth type or fifth level, as we can call it, are regional level NGOs. These work in a particular region of the world, such as the African region, South Asian region, Asian region, European region, North American region and so on. They work with specific countries in that particular region and they address issues that are common to the countries in that particular region. For example, Forum Asia and Asian Society for Entrepreneurship and Education and Development, ASEED. These are two large NGOs which work at the Asian level and they have membership of various national and state level NGOs from the concerned countries in that particular region of the world. These range from secular agencies such as ActionAid, Oxfam, CARE and so on, and Aga Khan Development Network. While there are many international human rights organizations that implement projects themselves, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, International Federation for Human Rights, there are also many international NGOs which fund national or state level NGOs, or they partner with them and they refrain from direct intervention at the grassroots. Some examples are Global Fund for Women, Ford Foundation and MacArthur Foundation. These are examples of INGOs which function as funding organizations on human rights issues. International NGOs may also work on specific issues or with specific stakeholders across the world. I'm sure many of you have heard of Greenpeace Foundation and WWF, which is Worldwide Fund for Nature. These work on environmental protection issues across the world. Child Relief and You, which is called CRY, and Childline, these are organizations which work on child rights issues across various countries. If we classify human rights NGOs by the nature of their work, they fall primarily into two categories. Firstly, operational NGOs and secondly, advocacy NGOs. Operational NGOs have a specific mandate to design and to implement development related projects. For example, WaterAid is an international NGO that works on providing safe water, sanitation and hygiene to all by delivering services. Traditionally, the work of operational NGOs is grounded in developmental as opposed to a rights-based approach. A developmental approach is essentially need-based. It is based on the perceived needs of the concerned community as opposed to the rights of the community, which a rights-based approach would adopt. For example, an operational NGO with a traditional grounding in development would address the issue of tribals based on their need for food, for health, for livelihood and other survival needs. This will be based on humanitarian and charitable purposes. However, a rights-based NGO would focus on the human rights of tribals with regard to law, possible human rights violations of those tribals, and it would also make socio-legal interventions to enable the tribals to assert their rights. However, it's important for us to remember that increasingly a rights-based approach is being used in developmental work by NGO actors and agencies. Thereby, this blurs the distinction, the line of distinction between developmental and rights-based approaches. The second category that I told you about, which is advocacy NGOs. These promote specific causes and issues. They are involved in raising awareness, in information discrimination, in public education and sensitization programs, campaigning on human rights issues, and they highlight violations and discriminatory practices. They also critique the laws, they critique the policies, they provide alternative provisions. Additionally, advocacy NGOs often engage in human rights research and documentation activities. They also involve themselves in fact-finding on human rights violations, and they publish educational material to raise awareness among laypersons and among specific groups of people. They may extend socio-legal assistance and support to victims of human rights violations. For example, Minority Rights Group International, which is also called MRG, works to secure the rights of minority groups and indigenous people around the world. Though the classifications discussed above help us to understand the various activities and approaches of human rights NGOs, operational and advocacy-based NGOs are not mutually exclusive. Many NGOs at the international and the national level increasingly engage in both operational as well as advocacy activities. Let us now understand the functions of human rights NGOs. Human rights NGOs discharge a wide range of responsibilities. These include, first, engaging in developmental work and providing services. Secondly, documenting human rights violations around the world. Thirdly, bringing visibility to such reports and documentation through media advocacy. Fourth, urgent action responses by which governments are contacted to bring to notice the violation of human rights of particular individuals and communities. Fifthly, by providing social, economic and cultural and legal support to individuals and communities whose human rights have been violated. Sixthly, preparing shadow reports and alternative reports to be submitted to bodies within the United Nations in relation to the extent to which specific states have discharged their international obligations with regard to human rights. Seventhly, drafting model legislations that incorporate international human rights standards. Eighthly, conducting awareness raising, perspective building, capacity building and public education programs on human rights. Ninthly, organizing protests, sit-ins and demonstrations. And tenthly, making interventions for providing relief and rehabilitation in context of natural and human-made disasters. NGOs work with stakeholders including women, children, religious, linguistic and ethnic minorities, indigenous people or tribals, physically and mentally challenged people, senior citizens or the elderly, prisoners and under trials, farmers, factory workers, child laborers, bonded laborers, LGBTIQ communities and many other such marginalized and vulnerable communities. In doing so, they protect and promote their human rights. Now let's try and understand what is the significance of human rights NGOs work. NGOs play a significant role in upholding human rights as spelled out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights called the UDHR and other human rights conventions and treaties. International NGOs are often large and influential bodies spread across several countries and regions of the world with close rapport with law and policy makers at the national and international levels. Due to this, they are successful in setting human rights standards and in holding governments accountable for human rights violations, as well as in persuading governments to enforce human rights standards within their countries. National NGOs play an important role of being conscience keepers of the government. National and state level NGOs also highlight violations of human rights that take place due to the actions and inactions both of state as well as non-state actors, and they campaign for justice and accountability. In this manner, they are a check against state power and state practices. Although ignorance of law is no excuse, layperson's knowledge of laws is extremely minimal, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this. The government definitely has a duty to disseminate information on various laws and legal provisions among laypersons, but this can be a Herculean task, especially in a country like ours, which is hugely populated. National and state level NGOs complement the work of the government in this regard through awareness raising on various laws and rights, on information dissemination and public education activities on the laws and rights of the people. They also engage in law reform processes to ensure that any kind of changes in law that take place are informed by voices and experiences at the grassroots. Additionally, they adopt various strategies in order to ensure an effective implementation of existing laws and policies, including by dialoguing with the government, initiating public interest litigation in the High Courts and Supreme Court of the country, and by holding press conferences and working hand in hand with the media. Human rights NGOs also conduct qualitative and quantitative research on a number of human rights issues, which are then used to advocate for law and policy reform. A smaller number of national level NGOs are also engaged in ensuring that international human rights standards are brought home into the domestic sphere. Human rights NGOs are not perfect or infallible. They too suffer from weaknesses and they face many challenges. Let us understand some of the challenges which are faced by human rights NGOs. Firstly, there is an absence of financial independence. This is one of the major weaknesses of NGOs, is that they are not financially independent as compared to the state or as compared to the corporations. Their financial dependence on the governments, on the international government agencies, as well as independent donors and donor agencies is seen as a weakness to the long-term sustainability of NGOs. Second challenge that is faced is a reduction of funding sources. The ethical values on which most human rights NGOs are founded, they prevent them from accepting funding support from governments and corporations, because both governments and corporations are seen to be major violators of human rights. So, human rights NGOs then resort to fundraising from national and international donor agencies which are independent of governments, and they are also independent of corporations. This reduces the funding options that are available for human rights NGOs. Third challenge faced by them is constraints with regard to government aid and corporate funding, where the human rights NGOs accept government aid for their work and in the interest of their survival and sustainability, they feel constrained in their work as they cannot freely and fearlessly criticize government actions, policies and laws. This is also true of situations where they accept corporate funding. Fourthly, there is a risk of becoming donor driven. This is a major criticism which is made of NGOs, particularly in India. Fifthly, there is an inadequate political power. NGOs are also criticized for having inadequate political power. A sixth challenge is state hostility to and suspicion of NGOs. This is true especially of NGOs which work on advocacy and do rights-based work. A seventh criticism of NGOs is that sometimes the NGOs adopt a very paternalistic approach, and this is sometimes criticized, and this is true especially of NGOs which are international in nature, and they may be making this kind of a paternalistic approach or a patronizing approach towards NGOs in the developing countries. An eighth challenge that is faced by many NGOs is the risk of co-option, and this is particularly so when they deal with government very closely and they work hand in hand with the government. In conclusion, the work of NGOs is paramount for the protection and promotion of human rights, and this is something that we will need to keep in mind in this particular module. So, with this we come to the end of this particular module, but please refer to the notes that have been given, please refer to the web links which have been given and the additional reading, so that you can develop a deeper understanding of the contents of this particular module. Thank you.